Oh, my word. Oh, good heavens. Thank you. Thank you. Holy crap. Thank you so much. Oh, stop. Ladies and gentlemen, behave yourselves. Thank you very much. Oh, my word. Oh, my goodness. Whoa. Stop. Stop. Oh, stop. Oh, you have. Never mind. Oh, my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, I can't find the words to welcome you to this extraordinary evening. It's extraordinary in my life. It may be extraordinary in your life, but maybe you have performed in front of 2,500 people before. I certainly haven't. It's an unbelievable pleasure to be here. It's very hard to know quite where to begin. I'm not a stand-up comedian. I don't have an act as such. So I thought we would experiment this evening. There are people all around me. Have you noticed that? It's quite marvelous. I was assured, ladies and gentlemen, Poverty Row! How wonderful. I've got 45 minutes, roughly, in which to speak to you on my own, and I have so many things to say. I'm likely to overrun because I'm such a garrulous person. I have logorrhea, and I'm going to choose somebody from Poverty Row, who's rather bold. One of you? I'm going to take someone in the front row. What's your name?
It's Esther.
Esther. This is Esther, ladies and gentlemen. Have you got a watch? You've got the phone? All right, okay. Making sure that it's on airplane mode. Go to the clock, right? Utility. She's got to turn it. She's turned it off. Her job, Esther's job, is to tell me when 45 minutes are up, because I'll get lost. I will be inebriated with the exuberance of my own verbosity. And thank you. You're on it. 45 minutes. Go, obviously if I'm in the middle of a joke, if I'm perched on the edge of a punchline, shut the fuck up, all right? But otherwise we're happy. Now, this is so exciting. This is a remarkable moment for me. I've really never done anything like this before. I've done talks to small numbers of people, and I've done the odd reading, but to try and keep 2,500 Sydney-siders happy is jolly difficult, because you have a reputation in Sydney. You probably aren't aware of this, but I was speaking to someone from Melbourne the other day. You're all wankers. Did you know that? Yeah, apparently. Oh yes, apparently. So this is quite nerve-wracking. Up your own asses, apparently. But that's fine. I happen to love this city. And what I did to prepare, because, as I say, I don't have an act as such, is I put out to my followers, on Twitter, I put out a question, name a number of subjects on which I could discourse or expatiate. And I got an enormous number of replies, and I couldn't help noticing that most of them had the letter W in them. See, I mean, obviously a lot of them started with what, where, who, why, how. People on Twitter can't spell. And, but also the subject matters seem to be involving the letter W. You see, I do occasionally glance round. And so I thought I would speak on a number of subjects that begin with the letter W, because that really is a way of focusing us all on lots of different things. If you know, it's a bit like writing poetry. If you have free verse, if you can just write in any way you want, then you look out of the window and you suck the end of your pen and nothing gets written. But if someone says you have to write a sonnet of 14 lines and it has to be an iambic pentameter and it has to rhyme according to this scheme, then it's sort of like filling in a grid. So I have these W's that I thought I would speak about. I've jotted them down here because I can't possibly be expected to remember them all because they're rather weird. Well, the first one is who, obviously, and someone asked me about a program which probably hasn't been shown over here, or maybe it has. It's called Who Do You Think You Are? And it's a British program in which you follow your ancestors. Right? Now, the reason I mention this first, although I did actually scribble it down, as I say, completely in random order, so how these things come out is a matter of guesswork, is because it occurred to me that although you are mostly, I suspect, Australians, and I am mostly not, we are very closely related. And it's an odd thing. I'm not a mathematician. There may be mathematicians in the audience, but most of us are probably more literate than we are numerate in this world. It just so happens. And yet we're not stupid. We know what is obviously true. Now, when I was asked by the BBC to do this genealogy program, Who Do You Think You Are? It's a quite interesting way of doing it, because they basically say you've got 2.5 weeks of filming. Carry a passport with you at all times. That's it. You don't know anything else. A car comes to pick you up in the morning. For all you know, you're going to fly to South Africa, or indeed to Australia, or to Central Europe, in my case, for the Jewish side of my family. And you've no idea what you're going to discover. And it's a very exciting thing to do. We would all dream of doing it. It's just wonderful when you've got a broadcasting company who does all the work for you and pays for the genealogists and so on. But I was talking to someone about doing this, and they said, "Oh, I do envy you." And their surname, for the sake of argument, was Clark. And they said, "You know, there have been Clarks in my part of Yorkshire for 300 years. And I thought, what a peculiar thing to say. And I'll tell you why it's peculiar. It's because, as you probably know, our surnames in our culture are based on the surnames of our father, whose surname is based on his father's surname, and so on. But it doesn't take too much for us to recognize that we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-grandparents, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, and so on. And then in a few generations, you have tens of thousands of ancestors, each one of whom is as responsible for your existence as the other. Go back in time and pluck one of them out of history, and you cannot exist. And only one out of 4,096 has that surname that you think is somehow who you are. But who you are is a vast panoply of people. So much so that if any of you has English or indeed Scottish blood in your veins, then you must be related to Henry IV, because you have more ancestors going back then than the population of Britain. So all I really wanted to say at the outset is hello, brothers and sisters. It's that simple. Anyway, let's have a look at the first W I scribbled down after that. Well, it's my... I was asked about WWW, the worldwide... Hello, welcome. Please don't... Just at least be grateful that nobody's looking at you. Thanks. Glad you made it. I know traffic in Sydney is 10 types of arse pig, so it's incredible you got here at all. I'm just in a hotel in the Rocks. It took me 20 minutes to get here, so anyway. I should have swum. That would have been more fun. It's a peculiar thing about the World Wide Web that we say in English www, which is literally 3 times more syllables than World Wide Web. WWW is 9 arsing syllables. It's not an abbreviation, is it? It's World Wide Web. But actually, I wanted to concentrate on my WWW. I grew up in England in essentially the 1960s and 70s. I was born in 1957. So my first conscious memories are of the 60s, really the late 60s when I was 10, and then through the 70s when I started to expand like some rare and beautiful flower. And it was in this time that I was blessed stroke cursed, initially you might think a curse, with a condition really very close to insomnia. I found it very, very difficult ever to get to sleep. And the only solution for me was not television or the internet, because although television existed, our parents allowed one television in a sort of servant's cupboard in a small room in the corner of the house, whereas it was expected to behave itself and only come out on royal occasions or possibly Wimbledon. And and it was black and white. My mother said rather desperately when somebody insisted on seeing the news, "Oh my God," they said, "it's black and white." My mother said, "Well, we got one of the very early colour ones, but it's faded." Pathetic. Anyway, so instead of television, I had reading. I had reading. It was the lifeblood for me. And the first real passion I had, the WWW of my literary firmament, were Wodehouse, Waugh, and Wilde. P.G. Wodehouse, Evelyn Waugh, and Oscar Wilde. And they mean still to this day absolutely everything to me. And I find it hard to believe that I could actually place one word after another in any kind of meaningful or coherent sentence were it not for these three masters of English prose. As it happens, Waugh was a huge admirer of Wodehouse, and it was only because of that that I ever read an Evelyn Waugh. I was so steeped in P.G. Wodehouse from the age of about 8 or 9 when I read my first collection of Jeeves stories. And on the back of every Penguin edition, there would be a quotation from Evelyn Waugh. He creates a world before the fall that liberates us from the one more irksome, and words to that effect. And I thought, who is this Evelyn Waugh who is quoted on the back of every P.G. Wodehouse? So I started to read him. And I mention that because it leads me on to my next set of W's. I'm going to come back to Wodehouse and I'm going to come back to Wilde. But Waugh's first novel, Decline and Fall, depicts a youngish man called Paul Pennyfeather, who, when he's sent down from university, has nothing better to do than go and teach in an English prep school. I don't know if you have the equivalent here. You have some very smart schools. There's one not far from here. I always think, it just amuses me as a name, that if you lose something, like this afternoon I did, I lost my special key that lets me into my dressing room here in the Sydney Opera House. I don't know how I did it. I was given it at the stage door, put it in my pocket. By the time I got to the stage door, I'd lost it, and there was a bit of a kerfuffle. And I was speculating on what happens to material that disappears, like, you know, socks and glasses and car keys and that stash of Coke you paid much. Sorry, that other things. Yeah, a bottle of Coca-Cola, for example, might disappear. And it occurred to me they're transformed into paramatter. And it's just one of those weird things. There had to be a use for paramatter. And it turns out it's what things are turned into when they disappear. Oh, Christ, it's gone to Parramatta. What a terrible thing. But anyway, don't know how we got there. Oh yes, yeah. I know there are famous, quite English styles. There's King's School Parramatta, isn't there? Are there any King's School Parramatta alumni here? Too ashamed. Interesting. Interesting. Anyway, so whether you have prep schools as well, I was sent away at the age of 7. To a prep school. It was 200 miles away, which in England is quite a long way. I'm aware, A, that in Australia it's no distance, and B, you have no idea what a mile is, because you sold out to the bloody French with your mètre, your kilomètre, to which you are welcome. Yeah, that's why our traffic's so bad, because it's all in kilometres. It's in London, you just get around everywhere. Zoom about. Because we've got miles. It's miles better. Whoever said it's kilometres better? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, sorry, we're going off on a tangent. I do apologise. I was sent 200 miles away from home, which is a long way, as I say in England, at the age of 7 to a prep school. And had a lot of trouble there, as I did in my other schools, got expelled from a lot of them, ended up in prison. It's a whole other story. It's a whole other kettle of bull waxes. But essentially, what I wanted to concentrate on is the fact that, rather extraordinarily, to me at least, after leaving prison, it was a nice, perfectly pleasant prison. Well, any prison, really. is a breeze after you've had an English private education, to be perfectly honest. You know, for heaven's sake, they tend to use lubricant. Well, no, well, it's... scrap that thought. No. Anyway, after prison, low down in my spirits, that I felt something had to be done with my life. It was an extraordinary moment, actually, for me. Be quite serious in a way, is that I decided I would get the exams that I needed to try and go to university. And having been expelled from so many schools, I had no exams at all, none that would fit me for university. So literally the day after I got out of prison, on probation, on two years probation, I went to Norwich, city in the east of England, capital of the area in which I grew up, East Anglia. Hooray for Norwich! Well, on the ball city. That's a football thing, don't worry about it. And they had a local college where you could enroll for a course of these exams that might qualify me for university. And it was the second day of registration, and I was quite late because we lived right in the middle of the country, and you had to get a coach and then catch another coach and eventually get into Norwich. And I ran to the place. I was at the end of the queue, and I got finally to this little smiley man. I can still picture him. He looked a little like, it's not relevant that you should know this, but he looked a little like the famous theatre director Peter Brook. I don't know if that helps you picture him. Rather gnome-like, benevolent face, little shiny, twinkly blue eyes. I got there, and he said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to do A-levels in English, French, and history of art." This is an English exam thing. You do 3 of these. And he said, oh, they're all full up. They're all full up. I said, no, they can't be. He said, no, I'm afraid they're all full up. There's nothing, we might get you into a history of art, but, really. I said, listen, if you accept me, I will get A grades in all of them, and I will also take the separate exam on my own to enter Cambridge, and I will get a scholarship. And he looked at me and said, what? We don't do Cambridge. We don't do teaching for the Cambridge exam. I said, I know, I'll do it on my own, but I promise you, I will get A's and I will get a scholarship. And then it was as if my whole life was in suspension. And he looked at me and I looked at him, really scared inside. I didn't really know what I was saying. And he said, all right. I don't know why. I was not to know that that moment was the hinge on which the rest of my life was to swing, but it turned out that it was, quite honestly. Fortunately, I did as I had sworn to him I would do, and after I had got the news that I'd got this scholarship to my college at Cambridge, I had a year before starting there, what is known as a gap year. Now, most students sort of pretend to be New Zealand. They pretend to be Kiwis. They put on some sort of nylon-based outer garment wear, and they go to the Inca Trail and they despoil all the great places of the world in their bright colours and rather that Scooby-Doo character, scruffy beards, and their otherwise charming New Zealand ways. And that's sort of what all students do now, I think, isn't it? They do the Inca Trail, or they go to the Southeast Asia somewhere, and they generally pollute the outer reaches of the world until they've grown up. And but I didn't do that. I wanted to emulate Paul Pennyfeather from Evelyn Waugh's Decline and Fall. I wanted a job as a prep school teacher. And I maybe because I've been expelled from so many schools, I felt that it was my job really to prove to myself that I was no longer an outsider, that I was perhaps an insider for the last time in my life. And so I went to this extraordinary place in Piccadilly, in central London, called Gabbitas and Thring. Extraordinarily Dickensian name, but I promise you it exists. And Gabbitas and Thring, which reminds me there was a fabulous, slightly queenie, Australian actor called Frank Thring, wasn't there? Yeah, probably, great man. I remember him in, wasn't he Pontius Pilate in Ben-Hur? Fabulous, fabulous figure. Am I wrong to call him slightly queenie? No, I don't know. Anyway, but yeah. He was the last of that generation of Australian actors who spoke in a more English accent than any Englishman who ever lived. Anyway, it's nice to be here on the stage of the Sydney Opera House, and remember, Frank Thring. Frank, there you are. Good. So I went to Gabbitas and Thring and said that I wanted a job teaching as an assistant master in some sort of school if they could help out. And they said, oh, we'll put you in our books and we'll get back to you. So I took a train back to Norfolk, back to my parents' house, and 2 days later, my father said, phone call for you. And I picked up the phone, and they said, oh, jubilant news, young Mr. Fry. I said, what is it? They said, we have a very nice little prepper in North Yorkshire where the classics master, Mr. Kemp Welsh, slipped on the ice and has sustained a fracture to his pelvic girdle. I remember that phrase exactly, pelvic girdle? Does anybody say pelvic girdle? But anyway, they did. And I said, gosh, North Yorkshire is quite a long way again by British terms. And they said, but no, happily, the father of the headmaster lives in Norfolk, and he will interview you for the post. And I said, oh, well, that's fantastic. So he gave me the address, and I bicycled over to this old rectory not far from where I lived. And there was a splendid old fellow who said, hello, come in. His name was Valentine, and a tremendous fellow, Mr. Valentine. I can't remember his first name. His son was Jeremy Valentine, was the headmaster of the school. He said, hello, lovely to see you, lovely to see you. Now, you've got a scholarship to Queen's, haven't you? He said, I'm trying to remember who the great cricketers who've ever been through Queen's College were. He said there was Oliver Popwell, who was a very decent wicket-keeper batsman. I remember him. There must have been others in my time. He then went on talking about P.B.H. May, who played for England. And I eventually said, what sort of duties would be required as a teacher? He said, well, Latin and Greek, you sound on those? I said, immensely sound Latin and Greek. He said, probably a little history and some French, I think, and some of the other masters may want you to fill in with their subjects too, and refereeing perhaps some rugby. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know the first thing about rugby. And cricket. I said, cricket is good. He said, excellent. And you've got a scholarship. Queen's very, very good. Very good. Excellent. Well, do give them all my best wishes, won't you? I said, what do you mean I've got the job? He said, oh, yes, you seem immensely sound. So that's how in those days you were given in charge of 100 or so young, impressionable minds. And I arrived the very next day at this school. It was an enormous parsonical master with his standing in front of the hearth, who said, it's our new classics bod. He said, hello. Ronnie Noakes, come and warm your ass by the fire. He said. And we had an exciting discussion about whether I preferred Thompson and Craddock or Kennedy in terms of Latin primers. And then the headmaster came in and said, excellent, good to see you. And the very first lesson the next day, he said, he said, Barry's a little unwell, so you're going to have to take his biology tomorrow morning. Said, biology? Oh, God, I imagined. At school, I remember cutting up frogs and all kinds of unpleasant things. I arrived the next morning at the chapel and the prayers, and I eventually tracked down the headmaster, and I said, what am I supposed to be teaching this for? He said, no, it's upper fifth. Upper fifth. He said, Barry wrote a note for you, here it is. And I read it. He said, dear Mr. Fry, I hope to meet you soon. Sorry I can't teach it. Upper fifth, they're very smart, don't worry, covering human reproduction. So that was my introduction to teaching, was human. It was a magnificent time, and it gave me some extraordinary insight into myself as much as anyone else. I don't know if any of you here are teachers, but I have to say, and I'm not saying this to crawl to you, but I have never in all my life done anything as hard, just in terms of tiring and exhausting and mind and body consuming as teaching. It is one of the most extraordinarily hard jobs you could ever do. Somehow your body gets used to it, but after the first 3 days, I was very, very minded to run away. I didn't. I stayed the course, and in fact, I continued to go back to that school to teach while I was at university. But that brings me on to another W, which is writing. Now, this is a very important one for me because writing is something I do all the time. There's I don't know if you're familiar with it, there's a marvelous Michael Powell film called The Red Shoes. And it's one of the great films. He's one of the great directors, Michael Powell. There's a scene in it that means a great deal to me. It's quite corny in a way, but it's so perfectly done because it's Michael Powell, and written by Emmerich, of course, and Pressburger, Emmerich Pressburger. And there's Moira Shearer plays this young girl who's a ballet dancer. And there's a kind of Diaghilev figure, an entrepreneur, an impresario, I should say, played by the fabulous actor Anton Walbrook, who's one of my favorite film actors there ever was. And her mother takes her to an opera house, the Royal Opera House, as it happens. The Sydney Opera House, quite simply, hadn't been built. And otherwise, they would have used it, because it's better and more famous and bigger and just somehow less English and more Australian and wonderful, therefore. So, but anyway, she goes to see this ballet, and in the interval, there is this impresario played by Anton Walbrook, and the mother drags her up to him, taps him on the shoulder, and he turns around rather wearily. And she says, I want to introduce my daughter, who's a magnificent young ballet dancer, and she should join your company. She wants to join your company. And he raises languid eyes and looks at her and says, why do you want to join my company? She said, well, Moira Shearer says, the daughter, she says, I've heard it's really very good, and it's the best, I think. You're absolutely wonderful, and I like dancing, and I think it would be wonderful fun. And he just simply turns his back on her and walks away. And the mother goes, well, and drags her daughter back. What a rude man. But you can see she stands there, the daughter, Moira Shearer, absolutely fixed, and the camera moves in on her face. Her eyes are sparkling with, you can't tell what. Is it fury because he's been rude? It's something very big to her. And she goes up to him. She taps him on the shoulder this time, not her mother. And he turns around and then he looks really annoyed. What? He says, I just want to say that I was wrong with what I told you. And I said I want to join your company because it's a good company. And I like to dance. It's not that I like to dance. I have to dance. It's what I was put on the planet to do. It's what I'm here to do. I have to dance. And he stares at her. Come around tomorrow morning, he says. And then her career begins. It's a wonderful moment because you do realize that for some people, lucky people, there is this imperative, this absolute need to do something. You just know it's what you have to do. And it almost doesn't matter whether or not anybody's going to pay you to do it. You have to do it. Now, in the case of ballet dancing, it sort of does matter that someone's going to pay you to do it because doing it on your own is a little tiresome and a little peculiar, and it draws attention from quite the wrong sort of people, I would imagine. But in my case, it was writing. It was something I had to do. And one of the reasons I had to do it was the second W of my WWW. The third, actually, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. I think I was about 11 when I saw, talking of English films, I saw Puffin Asquith, as he was known. I saw his version of The Importance of Being Earnest. The first time I'd ever seen the play. Had Dame Edith Evans and Michael Redgrave and Michael Dennison, Miles Malleson, Margaret Rutherford, an extraordinary cast, and Joan Greenwood and Dorothy Tewton. And I remember Michael Dennison as Algernon saying to Dorothy Tewton at one point, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? And I looked at that as a 10 or 11-year-old, and it was as if a curtain had lifted in my mind. I've never been able to sing. We may have a chance to get to that subject, thorny as it is. And I can't dance. And I couldn't play sport. But I knew I had within me some bursting passion for words. And they are the biggest W in my life of all. Words and writing. And when I heard that, would you be in any way offended if I said that you seem to me to be the visible personification of absolute perfection? I knew that I was in the presence of something quite extraordinary. And you can parse it and examine it and analyze it. It's kind of witty because Wilde is using extremely Latinate words for romancing, and they're usually rather technical, the visible personification of absolute perfection. Not I love you dreamily, but that. And it was somehow all the more seductive And so I remember we had this mobile library right in the middle of the country, and once a week, every Thursday, this van would come, and if you got there in time, you would flag it down, and it would stop, and you'd climb into it, and you'd get all the books out. And I got out everything written by Oscar Wilde, and including The Importance of Being Earnest, which I learned off by heart. Did you hear what I was playing on the piano, Lane? I didn't think it polite to listen, and so it goes. That's the first 2 lines. I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play the piano accurately. Anybody can play accurately. So far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte. And so, and on it goes. And it is the most magnificent piece of work, but it was the fact that this same thing I'm using to you now, this expulsion of air through the pharynx and larynx, out of the mouth and into the public world, can be beautiful, can be entirely, exquisitely beautiful. The very sound of a tongue hitting the back of the teeth, the procession, the rhythm of words can entrance, seduce, delight, thrill, and win the world. And it's a power we all have inside us. Those of us who can speak, can use language in the same way that a dancer uses dance and a painter uses paint. It's the most magnificent thing we have, and yet, oddly enough, the most ignored. It's what separates us from all other species more than anything else, and yet we tend to use it to pick up the phone and order a pizza, or to explode in a coughing fit. That often happens. I'm sorry. It's very sweet of him. Pop away. You'll be welcome to come back the moment you like. We've all done it. An aunt of mine did it in front of Laurence Olivier on stage. He was on stage, she was up in the balcony, she had a coughing fit. He actually stopped and said, "I'll give you a chance to get over it, otherwise leave." Imagine that. But this poor gentleman volunteered on his own. Thank you very much, I'm sorry about that. So language, yes, language entranced me, and from that moment on I was absolutely in the grip of the idea that language could be more than just a way of ordering pizza over the phone. More than just a way of saying, "Where's the nearest dunny?" Not that we use that word in England, I just thought I'd throw in my knowledge of fluent Australian. Right up to the minute, too, you'll notice. So Oscar became something of a passion for me, and it wasn't really much more than a year or so later that I read a biography of him by a man called Hyde White, Montgomery Hyde White, and I discovered... I discovered that through Montgomery Hyde that Oscar was not as other girls. And this was another chime within me that's a whole other story that, again, we may get to. But for the moment, I want to stick with the words and the writing, because it really was from that moment on that I decided and determined that whatever else I might be in the world, it would use language, it would use words, that they were the best I could offer. I was never going to be excessively pretty, charming, handsome, lissom, lithe, enchanting in any other way. But all I had was my voice and my, such as it might be, W for wit. I did discover that words are a magnificent protection against violence, as well as sometimes a magnificent provocation for violence. And at school, I was at an English public school, which, as I'm sure you know, means private school. And there were the kind of bullying, rugby playing types, the ruggerbuggers, you know, and the Philistines. And I remember one of them trying to beat me up, and I discovered the beauty here of words. And I would recommend this. You tell your children, if ever any of them say that they're being threatened by a bully, it always works, this. It's really good. Say, no, don't touch me, don't touch me, don't touch me, you'll give me an erection. You're welcome to use that. It's bloody hell, Fry, actually. Serious. Oh, you're weird. Oh. So anyway, I carried on writing and was more or less left alone, except when I chose not to be. But that's another story as well. So we're fasting forward all the way past this prep school, and I'm at university. I've gone to Cambridge University, which is one of the ancient universities of Britain. It just celebrated its 800th anniversary. So it's been around for a long time, and I was thrilled to be there. Some of the great heroes of my life had been there. Some of the great philosophers like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, and some of the great poets like Wordsworth and Milton and Byron had been there, Tennyson, and of course the greatest scientific breakthroughs really that had ever been almost came from there. Isaac Newton was there, and indeed was MP for Cambridge while he was there. Of course, Crick and Watson discovered DNA there, and Charles Darwin was there. So it was an extraordinary place to know that you were walking on these ancient stones. You were stepping into steps that had been carved by the footsteps, worn down in time by the Byrons of this world. And there were people you could meet who knew E.M. Forster, and it was just extraordinary place. And also, there was a history of comedy, extraordinary, rich history of comedy. There's a club there, well over 100 years old, called the Footlights Club. And in the 1950s, Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller came there, and they joined with two from Oxford, Alan Bennett and Dudley Moore, and formed this thing called Beyond the Fringe, which really kick-started in my country this whole move of what you might call sort of graduate humour. And it came to a flowering in the 60s when there was John Cleese and Graham Garden and Eric Idle, and there was Bill Oddie and Graham Chapman and Tim Brooke Taylor and a couple of Aussies. There was Jermaine Greer and Clive James, all there, all members of the Footlights, all writing material for it. And it went on all the way through Griff Rhys-Jones and a huge number of people. And so this was this terrifying thing. You arrive at Cambridge and you think you might be reasonably amusing, and oh my goodness, there's this extraordinary institution. You couldn't dream that you'd ever get into it. And indeed I didn't. I spent my first 2 years writing a lot, sort of journalism for local, the student magazines and reviews and things. Yes, I did write reviews. I was that much of a scum-sucking pig. But I've given up that. I don't do that anymore. No, it's right. We have nothing but respect for reviewers, especially the reviewers I most love are any reviewers that happen to be in here at the moment. They're just the loveliest and most special people that I've ever met. I went to a production early on of a play, Tom Stoppard's Travesties. It was absolutely magnificent. Really was extraordinary. It was really, I thought, brilliant for a student production. But what absolutely took my eye was this girl who came on stage. She played one of the parts in it. And it was the moment she stepped on stage, you just knew this was someone of extraordinary talent. I don't know, it's a bit like falling in love, it's a bit like fear, it's a bit like hate or extreme ugliness or extreme beauty. It's a visceral, physical, absolute quality. She stepped on stage and I thought, oh my heavens, what an extraordinary talent. She opened her voice. There are two qualities you need to succeed on stage, I think. One is you need to reassure an audience that everything's going to be fine. Your voice is going to solace and hit their ear. You're not going to be embarrassing or break down, or you're not so nervous as to cause disruption. You can just lean back and know that you're in the hands of someone fine. But in sharp contradistinction and counterintuitively, it's just as important that you somehow make people almost lean forward, that there's a tension and an excitement in the way you perform that just, it's an edge. And this girl had both. You knew she was in charge of herself, but you also knew that there was something fantastically exciting and something almost explosive about the way she walked on the stage and spoke. Anyway, I was lucky enough to get to know her and became friends, and her name, it may not surprise you to know, was Emma Thompson. And she was, an extraordinary woman. I'll just tell you a story that will give an example of how obvious it was to anyone who saw her when she was just a student, that she was nominated for an Oscar for her, as an actress, for her performance as Margaret Schlegel in Howard's End. And a lot of us who knew her were called up by the press, as you often are. And it's a sort of unwritten rule, you won't be surprised to know, that when the press call you, you don't speak about other people. Not unless you have the direct consent that it's an official thing. It's just bad form. You speak about yourself if you're so minded, but you don't blab about other people. So they hadn't got very far with her friends, but they found the number of a close friend of hers who was not a famous actor or anything like that, and he was rather caught on the hop when they said, we just want to know what your feelings are about Emma being nominated for an Oscar. And he said, well, I'll be quite frank with you. I feel, and I think most of her friends do, extremely let down by Emma Thompson. And he said, you can actually hear the drool hitting the carpet on the other end of the line. The fellow licked his pencil and went, yeah. He said, yes, anybody who ever saw Emma Thompson as an actress when she was a student would have laid any money that she would get an Oscar before she was 30. I think she'll be just over 30 when she gets this one next month. And he basically said all there was to be said. Anyway, we became friends and we were in a number of plays together, Shakespeare plays. I was, it's a strange thing when you're a student and you're doing plays. This is Cambridge, by the way, it's not a drama school, so this was not official. These were all extracurricular. I was supposedly doing a degree in English literature, but spending all my time really having an immensely good larky time in plays. And because most of the undergraduacy, if that's a word, were really between about 18 and 21, 22, obviously you had old people in plays. And I, because of my height and the depth of my voice and some quality of, let's be unkind to me and call it almost unacceptable pomposity, I was tended to be cast as kings and old figures of warty dukes and things of that nature. Sometimes a good part, sometimes even the lead part in a play, but often you come on and bless the, the couple at the end, and oh, it was being like that. While all the trim, pert undergraduates played the love interests, the Romeos and the Juliets. And that was fine. And so I did a lot of those, some of them with Emma. But in my second year, this is where it relates to writing, to Evelyn Waugh, and to the story I was telling you about the prep school. I was asked if I might write a play. And I said, what makes you think I can write a play? I'd never written any play before. I'd never written anything involving dialogue of that nature. I'd written lots of stories and poems, and I'd written the odd sort of humorous article in Broadsheet, the Cambridge magazine at the time. They said, no, I think you will be able to. So that holiday, or VAC as they were called at university, I sat down at an old manual typewriter, Hermes typewriter, and I thought, well, all I can write a play on is what I know about, and really, all I know about is schools and prisons, but I couldn't really. Cambridge hadn't asked me if I was on probation. It's not a thing they ask their students when they come. I didn't think it polite to volunteer the information, so I thought just best leave that alone for the time being. So I wrote a play really about a prep school set in the strange English world. It was called Latin. And it was a comedy, a sort of satire on the peculiarity of these places and the strange sexual goings-on. And it was accounted something of a success, and a company wanted to take it up to Edinburgh, where there's a big festival, as you probably know. It's the biggest sort of fringe festival of its kind. Nothing like what the old Adelaide Festival was, obviously, but it's still jolly impressive. And I remember Emma coming to it, and she brought a friend of hers, and I remember he was a tall chap with sort of triangular red banners of blush mark on his cheeks. I mean, not blusher, but he just had sort of naturally sort of rather flushed cheeks and big blue eyes. And I said, hello, and he said, hello. And that was sort of it, really. And the play carried on, and it won an award, which was very nice. And I felt rather grand. I felt I am a writer for the first time in my life. And then the next term, which was the beginning of my last year, Emma came round to my room, and she said, I want you to meet the president of the Footlights. I said, who's the president of the Footlights? I don't know. Why would the Footlights? That's all very pro-y comedy people. She said, well, you've written a comedy play. You can write sketches. You could write monologues. You could do that. Come and see him. He's called Hugh Laurie. And I said, well, yeah, is it? Amazing. I said, I know him. I went to see the Footlights show in the first year. But I thought he must be a third year because he hasn't been in the Footlights since. And she told me the story, which is that Hugh had come up to Cambridge expressly to row, to pull a boat through the water. We've mentioned Frank Thring and Ben-Hur, and we know that rowing is essentially something for convicts and galley slaves. But it seems that this Hugh Laurie, who had been expensively educated at Eton College, had devoted most of his teenage to pulling a boat through the water for fun. He was allowed to use the street unsupervised, and for all I knew, he could even use a telephone without supervision as well. But that's what he did. He arrived to Cambridge and comble de malchance, as the French say, huge misfortune struck him, glandular fever. Mononucleosis, as I believe they call it in America. He had this, which you get from kissing strange girls, I believe. But anyway, he got this condition, which meant that he couldn't row. And some Etonian friends said, well, you're a bloody funny fellow, actually. Seriously, no, bloody hell, actually. Really, join the bloody Footlights. You know, you'd be really funny. So Hugh said, okay, and that's where I saw him in the Footlights. And I have to say, I saw him and Emma Thompson, and Emma's boyfriend at the time, an extraordinary clownish actor called Simon McBurney, whom you may know from the Theatre of Complicité, the Théâtre de Complicité, brilliant fellow. And I just thought he was so good that it was almost unbelievable. And as I say, I then didn't see him in the second year, because in the second year he went back to this rowing thing. And then at the end of his second year, round about the time that he came to Edinburgh and saw my play Latin, he was supposedly debating within himself whether to be the president of the Cambridge University Boat Club or to be the president of the Footlights. Occasionally in an interview, he claims he tossed a coin and it came down Footlights. But anyway, he found himself president of Footlights with only Emma Thompson, really, who had ever been in a Footlight show before, because all the second and third years had cleared out, and so he wanted someone to write with. So Emma takes me to his rooms in his college, and the door is opened by his girlfriend Katie, and there's Hugh, and I can picture the scene exactly, sitting on a bed with a guitar, and he went, hello, and I said, hello. We are people who actually spell hello H-U-L-L-O when we speak to each other. And he said, I've written a song. That's the first thing he said. I think Katie said, would you like a cup of coffee? But he said, I've written a song. So he played the song. It was a marvelous song, made me laugh very much. And he showed me, I'm writing this stuff. And essentially, we started writing there and then. It was the most extraordinary thing. I can say this to you, Sydney. I fell in love. But it was a wonderful kind of love, because it was a comic love. It was a professional love. It was a collaborative love. I'm very happy to say, being something of a young bender, that I didn't fall in love with him in that way, because handsome and striking as he is, that would have been deeply embarrassing and difficult for both of us, I suspect. And I think he with me, we fell in love with each other as in the way that people who work together do. And it was another extraordinary turning point in my life. We started writing there and then. We wrote the panto, then we wrote a show, and then we went to Edinburgh. And this will sort of bring me... How are we doing on minutes, Esther? It's about 45, right? I'll finish up, because we've got our little question and answer session to come. But essentially, this brings us to no, shush and behave. It brings us to where we are now, in a sense, that when it got to Edinburgh, our show, we knew there was this thing called the Perrier Award, which was like, had just been instituted that year, which was the best comedy show on the Fringe. We also knew that the last institution that would ever win it would be the Cambridge Footlights, because, you know, we were old school. And what was beginning, this is 1981, was this new world of stand-up comedy. And we were all very much sketches, you know, knock, knock, knock. Come in. Ah, Perkins. The sketch would begin. Or it would be someone going, hello, I'd like to buy something that you obviously won't have in this shop. And so the sketch would develop. You know, that's a noble tradition. But instead we were getting very angry, earnest people, quite rightly, railing at the world, and we were really in no position to do that, living in panelled rooms with servants making our beds every day. So, yeah, quite. But anyway, we were standing on stage like this, and we'd finished the show one evening, and we were bowing, and there was this kind of kerfuffle. It was really odd, kerfuffle. And I turned and I thought, what the hell? And walking on stage was a man who had just become very famous because of a television series called Not the 9 O'Clock News. It was Rowan Atkinson, who was walking on stage. And the audience obviously all recognized him. And he went, can I... and we were thinking, this Rowan Atkinson, he's always been a bit weird. I mean, brilliant, but weird. He's actually gone mad. But he said, I would like very much to make the happy announcement that we have won the Perry Award. Then he did a bit of Mr. Bean's kind of... and obviously the audience laughed more than they had at us throughout the entire evening. Well, that was okay, because then on came the award-giving party and they gave us his award. And one of the things that happened, I think, as a result of that was that we were asked to perform the show on British television, and we got a contract, and we started a comic career, if you can call it that. But the most exciting for our purposes here is that a man called Michael Edgley asked if we would be asked if we would be interested in touring Australia. And a month or so later, we arrived in Sydney and then immediately went to Perth and did a tour. It was 1981. Some of you elderly gentlemen may remember. More gentlemen I use distinctly rather than ladies, although I'm sure many ladies will too, was the year that Ian Botham single-handedly wrested the ashes from your nerveless fingers. And so our show was called Botham the Musical, just as a way of dropping a few lemon splashes onto the paper cut. And you've had your revenge a few times since, obviously. But I think, who has the ashes now? Let me just remember. Oh, yeah. It's the same people who beat you in the World 2020 final, wasn't it? Oh, and the last ODI. And a rugby match. Anyway, no, great. It's how often can an Englishman stand on the stage and say any of those things? Let's be honest. Might as well enjoy it. So that's when I came to Australia, and Australia taught me a number of things. Most importantly, how to eat and drink. It was an incredibly exciting place to visit from a rather shabby, unhappy England. In 1981, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. It was before the Falklands War and before yuppies and the explosion of a kind of credit boom and a new confidence. It was still a pretty grotesque place, England, to eat and to live. It was pretty grey, although I'd lived a privileged life in some ways. We all knew that Australia was like, it's as if someone had pressed the colour button, and there was a lively and extraordinary, vibrant country where you sold wine varietally, which we'd never done in England. So I learnt about grapes. You could buy a Penfolds Grange for under $100. Can you imagine? And $100 was only about £2 in those days. And despite the peculiarity that you had to take the bottle to almost every bloody restaurant, there was also oysters and crayfish. Oysters Kilpatrick and oysters Rockefeller and oysters Casino. And I mean, it was just unbelievable, the food. I'd never had anything so plentiful and fresh and cheap and exciting, and the attitude absolutely overwhelmed me. It was a really remarkable experience. So I have forever since then been unbelievably grateful to Australia for opening my eyes to the pleasures of the table, but also for opening my eyes to a whole new continent with which I am deeply fond, of which I am deeply fond. And so it is really a strange journey from Woodhouse and war and wild and schools and writing and Cambridge to this great city. Thank you so much, Sydney. Thank you very much indeed. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, you're so wonderful. Thank you. Now, I'm going to go off. Thank you. Oh, bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you. You are lovely. You are unbelievably kind. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to go off now. Some rather attractive young men are going to do a little bit of stage building, which will take about 30 or 40 seconds, and then I will come on with Jennifer, and we will have something of a Q&A. See you in a bit. Goodness. Ooh. Well,
I think we'd all agree, actually, isn't it? W, as it turns out, stands also for wonderful.
Oh,
Would you like to thank him again? Look, let's begin by... No. I want to pick up actually on some of the things that you left, the gaps in the story.
Yeah.
The gaps in the story. I mean, as you say in your autobiography, the first autobiography, that you could read well at 3, and that you were writing accurately at 4. You've already told us that by 11 you were in love with the words of Oscar Wilde, yet we almost didn't hear your voice. I think you should tell us about how the world actually was given you by your voice coach, without whom no one would have understood anything.
Well, I gabbled. I spoke incredibly quickly. I mean, so quickly, and I was completely puzzled. Do you know there's a Star Trek episode where there's a... It's very important. Most of human history and art can be expressed in Star Trek plots. And it's true. Just to go on a slight side thing, I actually did the finals of my Cambridge degree was on the subject of Nietzsche and tragedy, and I mostly wrote about Star Trek, and I have to say I got a very good degree. It's partly because, just in case you wanted to write an essay about Nietzsche and Star Trek, was that Nietzsche argued that all tragedy was based on an opposition between the Apollonian and the Dionysiac instincts in ancient Greece, in particular Greek tragedy. In other words, the Dionysiac instinct for wine and revel and feasting, the id, as you might say, the animal part of us. And against that was the Apollonian, the harmonic, logic, reason, rhetoric. And that the Greek civilization was playing out in front of itself the story of its own beginnings, from blood feuds and trials and tribal wars and appetite and sexual lust and animal instincts, and this extraordinary thing of logic and reason that it had founded through Aristotle and the philosophers, and music and Pythagoras and everything else. And the two were constantly at war, as they are in all of us, of course, which is why tragedy is so fantastic a medium. And oddly enough, that's what most Star Trek stories are about. That you have...
Odd.
You have the captain in the middle who is trying to balance both his humanity and his reason. And on his left shoulder in the original Star Trek, you have the appetitive, physical Dr. McCoy. Everything's, you know. And on his right shoulder, you have Spock, who is all reason. And they're both flawed because they don't balance the two. And they're at war with each other. Bones is always having a go at Spock. And Kirk is in the middle, representing the perfect solution. And not only that, the planets they visit usually make the mistake of being either over-ordered and over-reasonable and over-logical, so they kill those who dissent, and they do it calmly and reasonably, and they have to learn to be a bit human. You will learn to be human. And or they are just a savage race that needs reason and order. So it's that quest of the universe. Anyway, that's why Star Trek is incredibly important, of course.
And the connection with
there is a Star Trek plot where there is a race who live at incredible speed. And they live so fast you can't see them. And there's just a noise. And through some use of, it's pre-tachyon beams, but through some particular technology, they manage to go onto their sphere, and so you see all the rest, everyone's like this, and the new beings are like that. Anyway, I was like that. I was super fast. I was unbelievably hyper. I spoke so quickly, I had to have elocution lessons because nobody could understand a word I said.
What did you sound like?
I was sound like because I wanted to talk like that, and it came out like that, and what did it mean?
Yes.
And people say, stop gabbling. And I couldn't understand it because I was living faster than anybody else, I think. I think now, looking back at it, I would probably have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and given, Rohypnol or what. No.
Ritalin.
I knew it began with R. This explains so many of my problems with my drugs. Really does.
Seriously, do you ever think how your life may have been different if some well-meaning doctor had prescribed you with Rohypnol?
It's interesting.
Ritalin.
How well-meaning would he have been, I wonder?
Yeah.
It would be more likely a Catholic priest, let's be honest. But no, Well, of course, it is now understood to be quite a common path, is to have attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity and so on, and then to develop the conditions that are then called bipolar disorder. It's quite a common route, and I do have that to some extent, and maybe this was the thing. I was so hyper and so fast. So this wonderful woman, who herself sounded as if, when she spoke, like a lot of these elderly English ladies who wore sort of lavender cardigans and beads, and her hair in a massive bun with a sort of steel knitting needle stuck through it, and wisps falling down. And she always spoke to my ear as if she was breathing in when she spoke. "Hello, dear, how are you? Very odd. Now I want you to say this." And it was that sort of strange voice. And she would get me to say things like, the thing would be Betty, right? We don't know who Betty was, it was never explained, but Betty had a bit of, she had a bit of bitter butter, it turns out, which she added to her batter, which, as you can probably imagine, rendered said batter rather bitter. But it's all right, it has a happy ending, because Betty then took a bit of better butter and put it in that very bitter batter that I spoke of earlier, and ameliorated its condition. And so I would say Betty had a bit of butter, put it in a batter, made a batter better, then Betty took a bit of better butter and put it in a bit of batter, made a bit of batter better. And she would say, "Slow down, dear." And eventually I would learn to say, "Betty had a bit of bitter butter and put it in her batter and made her batter bitter. Breathe, dear." Then Betty took a bit of better butter and put it in her bitter batter and made her bitter batter better. "That's bitter." And so that's kind of how I learned.
You are a credit to your coach. Do you have favourite words that you just want to go, that the very sound of them you love? You want to use every opportunity.
Sometimes they're place names. I became very obsessed with a village near me in Norfolk called Snetterton. And I would drive my mother crazy just by saying Snetterton. Snetterton. And you know, we'd be driving along. I'd say, "Oh, Mummy," and she'd go, "Yes." I'd go, "Snetterton." I'd go, "Oh!" You know, and she'd always fall for it. And I just, to this day, I sometimes on the phone go, "Snetterton," and she'd go, "Oh,
You said that your facility, your dexterity with language, proved a great kind of shield against bullies at school. However, counterbalancing that, I would have thought, was that about 7 or 8, you gave up any sort of possibility of collecting butterflies or football cards. You started to collect facts.
Yes."
Now, there's nothing worse
More
than
annoying.
a lippy know-all.
Yeah.
So how did that balance out?
It didn't.
Good with words, dull with facts.
There was nothing worse than me when I was young, I suspect. It coincided with a number of things. I virtually memorized some of the sections of the Guinness Book of Records. So I was able to say the longest ever episode of hiccups without cessation was Ronald Purdue in 1957, who for 13 years, 7 weeks, 4 days, 9 hours and 2 minutes had sustained involuntary spasms of the epiglottis, also known as hiccuping. And by this time the room would be empty, of course.
And the Fry car trips must have been very painful.
They were. Counterbalanced, I've used that word rather too often this evening, but against that must be set the fact that I was also extremely disruptive. Again, part of this mania, despite the fact that I could learn so much, I was almost incapable of concentration, I think. It's certainly in terms of social situations, like a classroom. Couldn't concentrate, so I was always being sent out. I was always a nuisance, I was always lippy, I was always, just a general disruption. And I just felt different. I felt that everyone else was ordinary, but also everyone else was luckier. Everyone else seemed to find life a more natural, less surprising phenomenon. To me, life was a constant puzzle, both as I hit adolescence, an explosion of beauty that took my breath away, so dawn and sunlight and animals and cobwebs caught in the rays of the morning sun, whatever it might be, the smell of earth would just have me in paroxysms of delight. I mean, like a dippy, dizzy, silly romantic poet. And love smoked me amidships too. But also, I I couldn't seem to just be ordinary like other people. I didn't like the things they seemed to like. Sport I didn't like. Ironic, I now adore sport, but at the time I really hated it with a passion. I would probably run 6 miles away from the school in order to get away from a running session. That's how peculiar I was.
Did it ever occur to you that there is a connection between that and the naughtinesses, as you say, the hijinks, and eventually the crimes
Yes.
that you got up to, the credit card theft? I mean, you ended up in prison, as you've mentioned.
I find it hard to persuade people sometimes that almost everything that motivates me in life is emotional and appetitive. It is not intellectual. People think that because I speak in the way I do, or because I'm interested in knowledge the way I am, and because I prize logic and reason extremely highly, that therefore I am above, or regard myself as above, emotion, that my whole life has been driven by nothing but desire. And
For?
all kinds of things. It started, I think, with sugar. I know that sounds mad. I write a whole chapter about it, my devotion to it. I was born in the same year as a breakfast cereal called Sugar Puffs. Strange little heat-puffed grains of wheat, glazed in glucose and sugar, and poured into a bowl usually, and to which sugar is added. Or in my case, you know how Americans in cinemas will have these huge buckets of popcorn, and they watch, and they just go like that till it's empty, with a slight film over their eyes, as if they're slightly playing with themselves. There's something slightly peculiar about it. I was like that with Sugar Puffs. I would eat the Sugar Puffs. We'd get through packets a week. My mother thought it was most alarming. So there was sugar. It was this desire. It was a feverish desire. It was absolutely enormous. It was replaced by cigarettes and sex, as things are, as you get older. That was the same physical thing, and they both involve huge amounts of desire followed by huge amounts of raging self-disgust. Or is that just me? I don't know. And in my later years, which will have to be volume 3, I had an episode, typically yawn-worthy, tedious addiction to the South American drug.
The marching powder with this.
Coffee. No, cocaine, yeah. So there was that side of me, and there was love, and there was the passion. And the intellectual side of me was always the servant, and still is the servant of that. And it is of all humans, because we are first animals. We are first, that is the bigger part of us. It's not that the reason is less important. The reason mediates and often loses a battle between desire. And as T.S. Eliot said, between desire and performance, there falls the shadow. And it's that shadow that has dogged me, and it's also the wonderful subtle penumbra in which we all mostly live. It's that exciting place where we try to balance, to fight off Bones and Spock, we return to. And so, yeah, for me, appetite is infinitely more the driver of everything I've done.
But was that time that you stole and the credit card theft and fraud, was that about desire for what you could get, or was it just because you felt so different?
I think it might have been because I felt different. We're talking about the very early 70s, 1970, 71 here. There was no internet. Well, there was an internet. It was made of wood and ivory. There were no email addresses. And I had known instinctively, but not necessarily by giving it a name, that I was what we would now call gay. I like to say as a ho-ho joke that I knew very early on that, in fact, the moment I was born, I looked up and said, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. But it's obviously not literally true. But oddly enough, when I did come out to my parents when I was at university, my mother said, well, of course, dear. I don't think there'd been a time when she wasn't aware of it. I don't know why mothers know these things. But it wasn't easy in the early 70s, for all that I could, be witty, and for all that this discovery of Oscar Wilde and then of his life gave me a hero he was a doomed hero. He was a tragic hero. And all the heroes there were for me to follow were literary ones. So in a sense, I have my sexuality to thank for the fact that too turned me to reading, because I was desperate. Once I'd read Wilde's biography, you'd learn to look at a bibliography and an index and just chase up every other name. There was Reggie Turner and Robbie Ross, and then there were other generations, Ian Forster, people like that. Robin Morm had written autobiographies, transgressive people who lived lives of sin and in constant danger of being exposed. But they were so often brilliant and creative and remarkable. So they gave me this secret self, and maybe the stealing, I'm not excusing it, and maybe the stealing and the climbing the roof of the church, the chapel roof, and looking down on the school while everyone else was at their rugby and everything, was the thing I liked to do.
Returning to your life, and we were talking about the early 70s, now the early 80s. You were, as you've explained, at Cambridge. You explained why Hugh Laurie went into comedy. It isn't actually obvious why you chose comedy. Why did you?
I'll be very honest with you. I didn't really think I was particularly suited to it. I thought I might be suited to writing it. And because I'd written this play, and because I was writing with Hugh, I kind of wanted to be on stage, because I'd done a lot of acting, and I wanted to be on stage with Hugh and Emma, but I thought Hugh and Emma were just way above me in terms of comic performance, and I wasn't sure what my range was. Hugh was funny in every way. He was funny physically, had a funny face. He could play, no, in a good way. He could goggle those blue eyes and just make one laugh. He could do those rather peculiar things, which have technical names, like slow burns and double takes. Which are particular ways of looking and, that sort of goggling thing. And I felt very self-conscious if I tried to do that. But when we started to write together, we write stuff for ourselves to perform. So it naturally fell out that the kinds of things we were writing would just fitted me like a glove. And I just grew more and more confident as we rehearsed and as we did it. And I naturally tended to take the role of the more pompous, the more bossy, the figure in charge, and Hugh, the slightly more forlorn, hopeless character. Like so many things, comedy, perhaps more straight away, is about confidence. If you don't think you're going to be amusing, the audience kind of knows it somehow. And even if you're saying lines that are funny, there's a strain and a tension and an embarrassment and a sweatiness that is just agony for both parties. And everybody starts that way, usually, unless you have the good fortune to write your own material, and especially if it's fictional material. If I'd started in 10 years later, when sketch comedy was almost illegal, and had to be a stand-up, I don't know how I'd do it. I don't know how they get their courage, how they develop this relationship with an audience, and it's usually they've got gonged off, and it's difficult.
But you said earlier you were born to write, but I think all of us who've been watching you, it looks like you were born to perform. I mean, you seem so comfortable in the way, it's been said of Barry Humphrey said of himself that he stands on a stage and all of a sudden he relaxes because he says to himself, alone at last.
Yes.
It's where he belongs.
I do feel that. I used to go as a child into Norwich with my parents and my brother, who's 18 months older than me. We used to go and see the Christmas pantomime, the Panto. And, if it was Cinderella, there's usually the young comedian figure who comes on who's playing buttons. Anyway, at the Panto, the buttons will come on and say, now, are there any boys and girls who'd like to join me up on stage? I was up there, straight away, stretching my hand so much the membrane of my underarm would split. I was just absolutely desperate. And at exactly the same time, my brother had sunk so far below the seat that he was completely invisible. We had the same parents, we had largely the same DNA, except for tiny differences, obviously. We were brothers, and yet why was it that the moment I saw someone performing on a stage, that was the side I wanted to be? And my brother, like most normal, healthy people, wanted to be in the audience, thank heavens. Though maybe in the modern world of blogging and videos and uploading and user-generated content, maybe more and more people are going to get the bug to perform rather than watch.
I wonder also, is that one of Wilde's observations, that man is least himself when he talks in his own person? Give him a mask and he will tell you the truth.
Yes, I mean, it's a profound observation, and like most of Wilde's observations, it takes a great deal of thought to unpick. At first it just sounds like a clever, reversal, a chiasmus, as an orator would say, you swap it, like, so his famous epigrams are quite obvious reversals, like, work is the curse of the drinking classes, for example. And it's great because it really works, as a, and it's funny and it makes you laugh and so on. But I do think it's true that you can express yourself best. As writers who write both types say, they tend to write fiction when they want to tell the truth. And they tend to write non-fiction when they want to tell a story. And it sounds clever, but it's absolutely true that facts get in the way of truth. Truth is something more fundamental than simple facts. And people get, sidetracked by a fact, but the truth of a thing is something much more profound and much more exciting. And fiction tells it better, and performance tells truth. So maybe we are all rather tragic figures of the natural performers, because we only really exist when we're in a space like this. When this finishes and I go off stage, I will trail forlornly in a melancholy state to my dressing room, and I will sit in a lonely fashion, and as has happened twice, what are the odds against this? I will accidentally spill the contents of a bottle of vodka down my throat, and then I'll just, be carried by the concierge of the hotel, vomiting over his shoulder, laid into bed, and wake up miserable and lonely until the clock tells me it's time to do the second one of these performances.
And you will wake up and animate.
Don't.
But they were incredibly fertile and active years for you, those years after sort of the footlights break through, and you came to Australia and discovered wine and Grange Hermitage for $1 a bottle.
Yes.
Radio, film, writing, theatre. You, in 1995, quite famously walked off the stage. You ran to, of all places, Belgium. You considered suicide, and you were diagnosed with bipolar disorder or manic depression. What I'm so interested in is you went on and made a documentary about that, where you talked about, and other people talked about, even though you wanted to be well, even though this was crippling your life in some way, there was something about the creativity of that disorder.
Yes, I mean, bipolar disorder, I called this film The Secret Life of a Manic Depressive, one has to be very, very straightforward about this. Manic depression, bipolar disorder is a very morbid condition. And the doctors here, they will be the first to say, this is not something to take lightly. It's something to be diagnosed. It's something, that it does cause, when I say morbid, I mean in the medical sense. It causes death. And it causes deeply unhealthy lifestyles and deep unhappiness for the person inflicted, and really hugely for their families and those who love them. And the way I'm often, because I made this film, asked by people who are in terrible straits of unhappiness, or they love someone who is in terrible unhappiness, they ask how to deal with it. If I could answer that, gosh, how happy that would make me. The closest I can come is to say that the mood is your own personal weather, and it's very like the weather. If you go outside and it's raining, it's not you that's made it rain. It has rained and it is real. You can't unthink the rain. You can't say, I'll walk it off and then it'll be sunny. The weather makes up its own mind. And the two mistakes are either to deny that it's raining when it clearly is. It's raining. Let's face it. And the other thing is to say, therefore my life is over. It's raining, the sun will now never come out. That's it. Because we all know, in terms of the weather, that it can be a damn nuisance when it's raining, but that the sun will come out. And it's the same if you're a manic depressive. You have a manic episode, you have a depressive. When you're depressed and you think you cannot conceive of such a thing as the future, life is so black you cannot imagine a tomorrow. Everything is just awful. Your energy is slow and there's nothing possible in life. It's terrible. It's actually painful. It's bad, really bad. It can be, for some people, so bad that they really have to end their lives in some way. They feel it anyway. But the fact is, it will come out. And in the case of a bipolar person, it won't just be normal, it'll then go super normal. It will become incredibly sunny. And rather than having no sense of the future, you plan for 100 futures. You are so excited with the possibility of what you can do in this world, with your creative power, with your entrepreneurial ideas. Your grandiosity knows no bounds. It's an extraordinary feeling, terrible for people around you. But I asked everybody I spoke to if there was a button and they could press the button, and they would no longer be, manic depressives. They would no longer have this bipolar disorder. Would they press the button? And only about 2 said yes, because that manic state is a thing to be treasured sometimes. I mean,
And is that true for you?
yes, it is. I'm very lucky. I have really what they call cyclothymia. It's in America they call it bipolar light. It is a more manageable version, but it does have its bad moments. But I spoke to people who had taken electric drills to their brain to kill themselves. I spoke to a man who was really extraordinary, called Rod Harvey. He had been a commander in the Royal Navy. He'd actually had a position on the Royal Yacht Britannia, as it happens, which the Queen, the royal family, used to have as their yacht. And he was a charming and splendid, promising officer, and he developed this condition. It became very, very bad. He had to leave the Navy, then he couldn't hold down a job. At one point, he was in a hospital being looked after, and his depression was so black, he got up, was supposed to have some security, but he short-circuited it, and he walked in front of a lorry, and he smashed both his legs. Now, he's the first to say, how could I do that to the lorry driver? For one thing, it's terrible. And he shows me his legs. That he can walk. They slowly, with the number of times they had to re-break them, set in metal. I said, the agony of both your legs. You could see the scars on it. He said, yes, but do you want to know something? It was nothing like as terrible as the pain that made me stand in front of that lorry. And that's the thing you have to understand with that kind of depression. It is not just, snap out of it. Things will get better. Look on the bright side. It is an illness. It is a real physical descent of something quite terrible into people's minds. And if you say to someone, I'm asthmatic or I'm diabetic, they don't go, oh goodness. But if you say I'm bipolar, there is a little look that can flicker in their eyes, and it's tricky. Not in Hollywood, of course. I interviewed my good friend Carrie Fisher, who you may remember as Princess Leia,
yes.
The daughter of Debbie Reynolds, wonderful, amazing person. And she describes herself as the poster child for full bipolar. It is sort of ironic because she's had a very tough and extraordinary life, as you'll know if you've seen or read Postcards from the Edge. But she said, Stephen, you've got it all. I said, what do you mean? She said, gay, Jewish, and bipolar. How can you fail in Hollywood?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I wonder if it was I think you said once that you could never live in suburbia because the sound of sprinklers brings you out in a hive.
Yes. Well, it's a kind of shorthand for me, sprinklers, or, I'm lucky to think, essentially, I've never in my life, since I was a child when my father made me, I've never had to handle a lawnmower. And a lawnmower to me is a symbol of something. And maybe Oscar Wilde is a good place to go here, because when I first became sort of well-known, I used to go to, universities would ask me to give a talk here or do a debate there or something or other, talk to a media studies, the way that they might. And occasionally you get asked, if you were staying in the university town, you get asked to, have a drink in people's rooms and so on. I don't mean anything salacious here. And when I was a student, and right up through the early 80s maybe, you would see the standard student posters. You'd see Che Guevara, Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon maybe, posters of them, because revolutionary politics and rock and roll were going to change the world. But as the 80s turned into the 90s, I noticed that these posters were replaced by principally 2 other people, partly because the death of Lennon, the stifling kind of ossification of pop music, the commercialization of it, the further commercialization of it, and the falling of the Berlin Wall, the clear betrayal that communism had made of any hope to be thought of as the friend of the working classes and the liberator of the oppressed. Actually, I started to see more and more posters of Albert Einstein and Oscar Wilde. It's as if the student generation realized that freedom and the future lay in the mind. Wilde said, if you want to be a grocer or a general or a politician or a judge, you will invariably become it. That is your punishment. If you never know what you want to be, if you live what some might call the dynamic life, but I will call the artistic life, if each day you are unsure of who you are and what you know, you will never become anything, and that is your reward.
We, before you arrived in Australia yesterday, contacted some members of the Twitterverse.
Oh, Lordy.
And we invited them to send in some questions.
Okay.
2 internet questions, because the first, which I just thought was very funny, from Steph Claire Noir. Would you like a Tim Tam? Do you have an answer?
If someone can explain to me what a Tim Tam is, I'm almost...
Well, you show
Is
up
it like a violet crumble?
It's like Milo in a biscuit.
Oh, I'm so ashamed. Of not
Another-
knowing. But I have had a violet crumble, if that's any use.
That's very good. We are running very short of time, but you, I believe, are the last surviving man who knows the answer to why 42. Douglas Adams' explanation for
It's,
the life, the universe, and
yeah.
everything. So what is it? Share.
It's really wonderful. The last time, it's almost as if my dear, darling friend Douglas, who died so sadly early, he was an extraordinary and a wonderful man, and I could devote an evening just to talking about Douglas, but it's almost sometimes, I think, as if he's in the room when I talk about this answer to 42, which he did vouchsafe me, because the last time I announced the reason for it, the microphone went dead. And if it was to happen again, we would be in real trouble. But the simple reason why 42 is that that simple. Yeah.
Final Twitter question, which comes from Warp975.
Right.
Will you accept the role, Stephen Fry, of our Lord and Master?
Oh, very well.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks, Stephen Fry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Rebecca, thank you so much. Thank you. You're very lovely. Thank you so much. Oh, bless you. Mwah. Gosh, it's good to be here. One thing I have to apologize to Australia for yesterday is I revealed the depth of my ignorance about your culture. And I use the word culture wrongly. I was asked in the question and answer session what my opinion was of Tim Tams. And I had to say, I don't know what a Tim Tam is. Yes. That's the noise, a kind of extraordinary whistling intake of breath, a horrified gasp. And to my hotel, I was sent by about 11 this morning, 7 packs of Tim Tams. I've not tried them yet because I thought I ought to do that in front of you. So I have here a Tim Tam. Here it is. Made by some very nice people called Arnott, it turns out. This is the classic Tim Tam, I'm told. It's biscuity, smothered in chocolate, and I'm going to eat it. If I die, I want the Museum of Modern Art in George Street to have my collection of ferns. All right. Oh, you know what? Oh, that's so interesting, isn't it? When I first came to Australia, the first city I visited was Perth. And you had these things called milk bars. And there was a subject, there was a really extraordinary drink that I grew very fond of, which was a sort of cold, whisked up thing called Milo. And there's a touch of Milo in this, isn't there? It's slightly malted, and it's rather nice. That's good. Tim Tam. Oh yeah, I could grow very fond of Tim Tams. That's terrific. Oh, delicious. I'm really fond of Tim Tams. Thank you for that. That's good. I fell in love with the Australian diphthong. A diphthong, in case you don't know, there's no reason why you should, is two vowels together. So in the word roar, O-A, is a diphthong, for example. Now, Australians, you seem to be able to put more vowels in a row than any other nation I've ever come across. Now, this was a long time ago in Perth, and it was a time, I guess, when people had vinyl banquettes in their dinettes. And there was a product so popular with these vinyl banquettes, a product called Doc Vinyl. If any of you is old enough or Western Australian enough to know of this thing, but there was an advertisement for it, and what you would see is a vinyl sort of surface of a banquette, and there'd be a rip in it, and a voice off would go, "Oi, no." There are 17 vowels in that, right? You might say, "Oh no," but no, "Oi, no." And at least 5 Ys. And the "oi, no" became my favorite phrase, and I would stay up at night just to watch the advertisement. There was also a telethon in which there was some sort of bear that you could buy for the telethon, and the presenter on, I think it was called 6KY, which sounds unlikely, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was called. It was innocent times. And he described this bear as ideal for gift giving interstate or overseas. And it was that cadence, interstate or overseas, which combined with "I know," made me realize that Rolf Harris was not the voice of Australia. 200 miles from home at the age of 7, I was sent away to a prep school. And I was already an addict because I was addicted to sugar. From a very early age, I had been completely addicted to sugar. There was a strange little thing called sugar puffs. It was extraordinary. My mother, bless her, she bought 7 or 8 packs of this a week, and I would pour them into a bowl, pour on cold milk and eat them, and then have another one, and then another one, then another one, and then I would have some Frosties, and then I would have some Ricicles. Always completely unaware of why it was there were some people on this planet who wouldn't have Frosties, they would have cornflakes without the sugar on. It seemed to me, it was like one of those mysteries, like why grown-ups watch the news on television, or why they're interested in people kissing. It's just a strange thing to a child that they might have Rice Krispies instead of Ricicles, and they might choose a life without sugar. And I didn't realize, of course, but I was part of an advance guard of a whole generation who were to be the most infantile generation in the history of our planet, for whom eating pulpy foods and drinking sugary drinks like strange, whizzed up ice cream with syrup of vanilla or syrup of strawberry, it calls itself a milkshake, that this, in America, you go there, and there are people, grown-ups, actual grown-ups with jobs, they might be lawyers, who go into restaurants and eat mashed up food and sugary drinks, then go across to a cinema. They're usually wearing baby clothes, kind of loose, strange things, and a baseball hat. And they sit with a great thing of popcorn wedged between their thighs and a sweet sugary drink, and they eat the popcorn like this, their eyes slightly glazed over, and they watch a 3D action film. And these people are grown-ups. They are actually part of the most powerful democracy and economy in the world, and they're allowed to use the street unsupervised, and they're allowed to vote, and the world has become entirely dominated by sugar-eating, pap-loving, cheap culture-loving people. And I'm proud to say that there's a part of me that is entirely on their side. There is a bigger part of me that is deeply ashamed and embarrassed to be that. No, it so happens I'm allergic to anything with hot milk in it, and especially if it has a skin on it. I actually only have to think about it. You know Jean Cocteau, the French artist, poet, filmmaker? He had a party trick, which was well reported, that he could, and often did, him being French and all, lie naked on a table at parties, and he was able to, how can I put this delicately, ejaculate, without touching himself. By the power of thought alone, he could actually bring himself to a shuddering and excitable climax. And I can actually make myself retch and vomit just by thinking about custard with a skin on it. It's marginally less in demand as a party trick, but it's something I'm quite proud of. It just so happened in my second term, my parents took me to the station in London, Paddington Station, and there was the school train. I know it sounds absurdly Harry Potter, but that's the life we lived. There was you'd see at the end of the platform this sea of boaters, these straw hats, and these little boys, and these mothers and fathers saying goodbye to their little children. By this time I had just turned 8, so I was feeling very grown up. And I went into a compartment on my own. My brother went up to a compartment full of older boys, because he was a couple of years older. And I sat down, and I noticed in the corner there was this small, tragic little dab of misery, this little snuffling child, who seemed to be about 4, but he was in fact 7. And his name was William Bunce. Because I asked him his name, and he said, William Samuel Anthony Farlow Bunce. And for some reason, he brought out the protective in me. I suppose I was so proud that I was older than him, that it was my second term. I taught him not to be afraid, not to show his fear, that everything was going to be all right, that people were quite nice, really, and it was all going to be splendid. Anyway, the result of it was that he rather worshipped me. And so for the next couple of years, he would follow me around in a very sweet way, and with big brown round eyes. And just anything I did was superb as far as he was concerned. And it's rather marvelous to be worshipped when you're an 8, 9, 10-year-old, and especially if you're a wicked one, as I was. A wicked one addicted to sugar. And I would break out of the dormitory at night, and I would go down into the school kitchens, and I knew how to open a window from the outside, because they were locked, and crawl in and go into this larder where they had huge chunks of catering jelly, the raw blocks of it, and I'm going to tear them like a lion tearing open an antelope. You know, it was just savage. But occasionally they sort of got wise to it and put a big padlock on the larder and the cold room. And there was a tuck shop. And the tuck shop was quite good, but my parents would send money to the school, which was my pocket money. And there would be a master who'd have this big ledger, and there would be, let's say my parents sent £2, which was a huge amount in those days. And I would spend it on tuck, and each amount would get dwindled down. By 3 weeks into the term, I had used up my £2. So I would, what's the word? There is a word for it. Steal, that's it. I would steal things and sell them. I mean, it's just monstrous, all to feed my sugar addiction. This is really where you rehearse the entire business of drugs that benights and bedevils the world. And came one occasion, I blush to remember this, there was a village shop. And in the village shop, there were all kinds of extraordinary sweets that were much more, to my eyes, glamorous than the ones in the tuck shop. The ones in the tuck shop were big jars with humbugs in, and bonbons, and toffee eclairs, and actual toffees, and acid drops. Very old-fashioned, rather wartime confectionery. And the school, which was staffed by a lot of ex-soldiers, and mostly the staff were called Commander this and Major that, they regarded anything more dazzling as slightly vulgar. And certainly the things in the village shop, they had these little things that fizzed in your mouth, and they had, like sherbet things, little flying saucers made of rice paper that you put in your mouth, and the sherbet exploded, and foaming shrimps, and I don't think I'd ever eaten a shrimp, but I'd eaten lots of foaming shrimps, and and of course, the thing that was going to build to my next addiction, there were candy cigarettes with little red dots on the end to show that they were light, and there were chocolate cigarettes wrapped in paper, and there were licorice pipes, and there was even a sort of rolling tobacco made of coconut, and dusted with some sort of chocolatey thing, and came in a Spanish galleon waxed paper thing, and that was one's tobacco fix. And there was bubble gum in my day, Beatles bubble gum. It's terribly exciting. Because they'd have little factoids. You'd not just get the bubble gum and a picture of the Beatles with their guitars, you get a little factoid. George is the tallest of the Beatles, exclamation mark. There's always an exclamation mark. John likes ham for breakfast, but he really hates sausages, exclamation mark. And I built up a really powerful knowledge of the Beatles on the basis of this bubble gum. And there was Bazooka Joe, and there was Pez, and there were all these sort of things. And of course, the point is that it was in the village shop, and it was strictly out of bounds. You were not allowed to go there. I, on one occasion, went to the village shop with some money that I managed to get together. And I had an absolute orgy, a blitz, and I bought everything I could possibly buy, sherbet fountains and sherbet dabs and all the rest of it, popped them in my pocket, went back to the school and whistled nonchalantly through the corridors and found a little place around the corner in which to feast on my kill. And a prefect came around the corner and saw me with a sherbet fountain, which meant only one thing, that I had been to the village shop. And he said, right, because he had it in for me. He said, right, I'm taking you to see the headmaster. He took me to see the headmaster. And the headmaster said, Fry, I've warned you, this is not going to be 3 strokes. This is not going to be 6, it's going to be 12. And I said, it wasn't, I didn't go to the village shop. He said, what? The evidence, we've emptied your pockets. No, somebody went for me. He said, what? Who? I said, I can't possibly tell. That would be so wrong. If you don't tell, you'll get the 12. It was Bunce. Bunce was the most saintly child that has ever drawn breath. The kind of child you used to read about in childish literature by Roman Catholics, about the early lives of saints. And he was sent for, and he arrived in a puzzled and pink state, never having been sent to the headmaster's office before in his entire life, except possibly to receive a prize. And I managed to exchange a glance in which I nodded, and he bravely and stoutly nodded back, knowing that whatever he was to be asked, he was to give the correct answer in my favor. Bunce. Sir. I understand that you went to the village shop. His eyes darted towards mine. And I gave a sort of, yes, you did, didn't you? He went, yes, sir. Yes, I did. Bunce, you know that going to the village shop is against school rules. Yes, sir. Bunce, did you go to the village shop? He looked at me again. Yes, sir. Bunce, did you go to the village shop? No, sir. So I had 12 strokes every day for a week for recruiting Bunce into my web of sin. And it was a tragic moment, relieved somewhat when about 6 months ago we were recording a series I do of a sort of quiz show for the BBC called QI, which I believe they show over here. Oh, you're very sweet, thank you. And in the green room afterwards, this person came up to me and said, you don't remember me, do you? And I looked, I said, no. He said, it's William Bunce. I said, but no, you're 10. How could he be 50 odd? It seemed insane, but he was. He was still only about that high. And I said, do you remember that time? He said, oh, yes. He said, do you remember the other time? I said, what other time? He said, it was our second term, it was the Christmas term. And I asked you about your family, and you said, oh, my parents were killed in a car crash. I'm brought up by aunts, a succession of aunts around the country. And yeah, it's very sad. And his eyes, he said, I remember crying when you told me this, because He really did. He cried. And then, a few weeks later, this is the trouble with being a liar, as I'm sure all of you who are liars know, is because the lie isn't truth, it resides in a different part of your brain from experience, which is truth. So he asked me casually, just before the end of term, where I was going for Christmas. I said, well, to my parents in Norfolk, of course. And he said, but your parents are dead. And he said to me recently, this is what he said, he'd never forget it. This is what I said to him. I stared at him and said, yes, you see, Bunce, I say these things. The thing that most upset me in all my life was not being able to sing. And I'll tell you a story about this. Back in the mid-'80s, there was a series on British television. It was a few years after I left university. And Hugh Laurie and I were kind of like a double act, as it were. We hadn't yet done our own TV series on our own exactly. But we started as a double act on this series called Saturday Live, a not unobvious rip-off of the American Saturday Night Live, but it was actually a very different sort of show. And we would do these sketches together on it. And one week we wrote one which involved me having to sing. And I can't sing. I mean, I really, really can't sing.
I saw you sing once on QI, and that's true.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I really can't sing. And it's a deep embarrassment to me and a deep sorrow, because I'd love to be able to. It's like, imagine being a sparrow who can't fly, you know? Everyone else can sing to some extent, but I just can't. I'm not tone deaf. I can actually tell, often I can tell C minor, I can tell G minor, I can tell D major, I can tell keys. I'm actually quite good. I pick out tunes very easily with my ears, I just can't reproduce them. So I'm tone dumb. Anyway, we wrote this sketch, and there was this bit where I sing, and I go, yeah, and on the day I'll sing. And Hugh said, well, you've got to start now. I said, but I can't, you know I can't sing. He said, well, we've got to rewrite the sketch. I said, but it's kind of perfect the way it is. And he was doing his musical stuff. He can play any instrument, sing, you know, and so on. So he said, well, it's obviously psychological. He said, you may not know this, but I've actually heard you sing. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, you didn't think I was in the house. We used to share a house, don't get weird, but we did share a house with his girlfriend, anything. But I was apparently having a shower, and he'd come in because he'd forgotten something, and I was singing because I thought I was alone. If I think there's someone within the same postal district as me, I will shut up. So, anyway, this has a purpose. He said, it's clearly psychological. Go and see a hypnotherapist. So I let my fingers do the walking, as you did in those days, because before the internet, and I opened the yellow pages, and I plucked out the name Michael Joseph. Don't know why. And I went to his little offices, made the appointment. He turned out to be Hungarian, rather bizarrely. His real name wasn't Michael Joseph, but he changed it when he came over. And he said, tell me what is the problem. And I said, well, he obviously expected me to say smoking, sex addiction, something like that. And I said, I need to be able to sing live on television. He said, right. He said, okay. He said, what I'm wanting you to do is place your hands on your thighs, like so. And it's strange how the flesh is melting into itself until you can't feel your hands and your legs as being separate, and you're being lowered down a well. And as you're lowered down, the light is getting smaller and smaller, and you're becoming darker and more enclosed. But it's fine, because there's a rope, and the rope is my voice, and it keeps you safe. But you're fast becoming enveloped by the darkness. And I was kind of away. It was wonderful. And so he told me to talk about why I couldn't sing. And I had a memory. Back to prep school, on the first Saturday when I was 7 years old, we had this thing called Cong Prac. This is typical English rubbish, but it was called Cong Prac. It meant congregational practice. And you had to practice a hymn that you were going to sing in chapel the next Sunday. And there was a hymn called Jerusalem the Golden. And I was singing with the others, and a prefect called Kirk, which I remembered under hypnosis, his name was Kirk. He walked past and he went, ha, Fry's singing flat. and the music master said, "Stop, everybody, Fry, sing on your own, after 3, 3, 2, 1. And I was like 7 years old, and I was in the school, it was my first weekend, I was terrified, and I just... and everybody laughed. Everybody laughed at me, and from that moment on, it seems, I had never been able to sing. So he unlocked this extraordinary memory. And then he said to me, he said, what is, when you are doing this television program, what is the, what's the word in English when somebody says something and then you say, your cue, what is your cue for the singing to start? And I said, well, my colleague Hugh says, hit it, bitch. Which was the cue. And he said, right, okay. So, when you hear the words, hit it, bitch, you are back in your relaxed shower at home and you're singing happily. So now I will pull on the rope and you come up out of the darkness, etc., etc., etc. So then I arrive and Hugh says, how'd it go? I said, I think all right. I think it was really interesting. And I told him the story about Kirk. And I said, tonight, when we're live, if you forget the cue, hit it, bitch, I will never speak to you again. So it's fine. He remembered the cue. And now, I could probably sing on this stage like Placido Domingo if only Hugh was here saying, hit it, bitch. That's basically my thing.
You mentioned on your way through the prison bit, to which we might return. Let us return briefly to the prison bit, because if for no other reason, it's one of the best named prisons.
Yes, it's a prison. It was a prison called Pucklechurch. It sounds, doesn't it, like a little village somewhere in the Cotswolds, beautiful stone and lobelias and roses growing around the door. Welcome to Pucklechurch, my dear. But in fact, it's since been closed down because it had so many riots. The newspapers would occasionally call me up and ask if I had any comment, as if they were asking about, my old school. I had, probably some of you, I don't know, this is the thing that happens in prison, there's a rather surprising curiosity amongst people to know why somebody went to prison, and some of you may be interested, but I'm sure, no, you don't want to know why I went to prison. No.
I think they do.
It's so dull, it's most peculiar. It's, well, credit card fraud. I lived in a time when there were no magnetic strips at the back of credit cards, and you had a little roller you put over them, and there were no phone calls made. You just handed over a credit card, and you got goods and services accordingly. All you had to do was imitate the signature, which I was very good at. It was a wonderful, idyllic, innocent time, and these horrible chips and stripes they put in them now, I think that's mean. But I was 17 years old, and I'd sort of run away from home, and actually I hadn't meant to steal the credit cards. In my defense, paltry as it is, I'd gone into a pub and spending the last of the money I had, and I realized I was going to have to sleep rough or in a park or something. And on the way out, I did steal somebody's coat, because I wasn't, dressed for the night. And in their coat was a wallet with 2 credit cards, an Access card, which is like an early MasterCard, and a Diners Club card, of all things. And I learnt the signature. His name was Edwin Gray, God bless him. I was aware, because my father had lost credit cards, I was aware that you didn't pay everything. There was the bank, as long as it was reported missing. And I kind of calculated that he would report it missing, because he'd find his coat missing and say, oh, my wallet was in there. And the next morning he'd call up. So I didn't use the card for about 3 days. And of course, they may have gone on this, but there was no computerization for it. And I left, and I went to the West Country in England, and I was seeing school friends and things, and I spent enormous sums of money on suits and clothes and high-end hotels and meals and things.
What were you thinking?
I don't know what I was thinking, Jen. I was a little bit mad. And eventually, in the town of Swindon, which is a rather unremarkable railway town in Wiltshire, I was in a hotel room in Swindon, and the one thing I hadn't been able to get was shoes. I have very big feet, size 13 feet. I finally found a shoe shop in Swindon and proudly bought a pair of shoes on the credit card and was coming back. And the sharp-eyed receptionist had noticed on my way out that this well-dressed young man in a suit, rather young for a suit, 17-year-old, but a very expensive-looking suit, had such shabby shoes. She looked at my credit card, because you'd given, you know, you give it and they run a copy of it, and she called up the company and said I was wanted in 6 counties. And so when I got to my room, there were 2 men in it, and I was used to hotel living at this time, and I thought they were sort of male chambermaids or something. I said, no, I don't need you in the room. And they said, Mr. Gray, which was, of course, the name I was travelling under, that being the name of the credit cards. And I said, yes. And they said, Swindon CID. I said, great words to hear. And I went, oh, dear. I said, and, of course, now, I didn't want my parents to be involved, because I'd given them enough trouble. So I didn't want to say my real name. And almost everything I had was things I'd bought on the credit card. But I had a few books and things. Anyway, I'm in the police station is opposite the hotel. It's a typical choice of mine. So they snap handcuffs on me, and rather sweetly. So this handcuff, let's say, is handcuffed to a policeman. So it's not like that. It's to a policeman, and he puts his hand in my jacket pocket like that. So both our hands, so that it covers up for the sake of the hotel, covers up the fact that someone's being led away. And then I'm sitting in the sort of interrogation room, whatever you might call it, and I hadn't noticed this, but one of the policemen had been going through my luggage in another room and seeing the names written in books and things, some of which were stolen, of course, and so he'd come in and go, you know, Richard Anderson, in a very low voice while I was being interrogated with the other one, and of course I wouldn't notice, because the name Richard Anderson didn't mean anything to me. But at some point he came in and went, Stephen Fry, and he went, yes, and he went, ah. But then I went to Bucklechurch. It is a hard enough nick, as they say. It was actually a rather breakthrough moment for me, because I could see some of the. I was a spoiled boy. I had grown up in a big country house with, you know, servants and I mean, not madly Gosford Park, but, you know, pretty, you know, gardeners and what have you, and a private education. And I'd not really seen anything of the world, to be honest. And these kids around me, they were mostly illiterate. And they came from Wales and the West Country. And so they now, that just happened to be the catchment area, Old South Wales and the West Country. So they all spoke like that from the West Country. Well, they're Welsh, weren't they? I'm a thief, right? But I'm an honest thief, innit? And,
and you go in there talking about sherbet bombs and all your sweets.
One of them came up to me and said, I really love it if you would teach me how to read. Said, I just know that's a really important thing to do, and I can't do it. If you can teach me to read, I'll be an happy man. And I said, okay, and it gave me this fantastic kick to think of being able to do that. And I wrote out the alphabet, and I wrote out sentences, and we went through them, and he was so keen to learn. He learnt really fast. He was like someone who'd always been blind, suddenly been given sight, because you'd see him stopping in the corridor, going things like, no loiter, no loitering. Oi, you! Stop loitering! And it was just like, it was so funny. But he would read the signs, every sign. HM prisons only, and things like that. It was just, it was really. I was proud of myself. And the most touching thing was when my parents came down and saw me in prison, visited me, and I had to see my mother, my dear darling mother. It's so terrible, this. She had cut out about 50 Times crosswords and put them with a little paperclip, and she pushed them under because she knew that I would enjoy them. And that made me more ashamed, more unhappy, more determined to do what I explained earlier that I did, to get the exams and to go to university and to stop.
To fly.
To fly.
To fly.
dons, as they call the fellows, the professorial staff, are extraordinary figures. When I went for my interview to Cambridge, I was sort of terrified. These amazing buildings, these extraordinary, the worn stone steps, and you think, gosh, Byron trod here, and all that. And I saw two figures in gowns, two men, and they were having an earnest discussion. I thought, I'll creep up behind them, and I bet they're talking about Wittgenstein, whom they probably knew, or Bertrand Russell, or they're talking about, some scientific thing, or they're talking about Greek poetry or something. And I heard one of them say, no, it's a most extraordinary substance. It's dried and knobbly. It's sort of comminuted noodles and chicken particles, and it comes in a sachet. But all you do is add boiling water, and it's singularly toothsome. It's made by a company called Knorr, but it's a silent K, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And I thought, well, there you are. That's Cambridge for you, obviously. It was a bit of a letdown. But one of the other marvellous things I love about academia, they very kindly elected me an honorary fellow of my old college just a few years ago. And I discovered, when sitting at the high table, as they call it, where these people are, that in the discussions, if an academic has a mild disagreement with another academic, they will say, Professor Ainsworth is a blithering idiot. He is a fool. He has no knowledge of anything. He is an imbecile. He should not be allowed out. He should have his degree taken away from him. He should have his gown torn to shreds, and he should be kicked by the posterior out of the bounds of the city of Cambridge. There's a small disagreement. If there is a fundamental schismatic disagreement, it says, while none yield to myself in my admiration for Professor Ainsworth, there are one or two tiny elements on which we disagree. And you have to learn that. It's a very strange way.
How fabulous.
Odd thing is, people who knew that I was doing this said that Stephen is such a peculiarly hyper figure. He's the only person we know who takes cocaine to slow down. And I honestly did. I took it. I never took it during the day. Well, it's very rarely, only if I wasn't working, and I was almost never not working. But, I would take it to mark the end of the day, because I'm a rather dull stick. If work ends, I don't really like parties very much. I like dinner tables where you can talk and listen and have a conversation, but music thumping and people yelling at each other over that music, I get sweaty, and I, of course, can't dance, and I'm not interested in dancing, and the whole thing just doesn't work for me as a party. But this artificial stimulus gave me an extra few hours every day. Instead of going to bed at 10, I would go to bed at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. And it's an absurd thing. And of course, it gets to you in the end. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to anybody. And of course, it was cowardly and pathetic and weaselly, but it was it was a natural move up from the sherbet in the sherbet fountains and sherbet dams,
I can see.
It's still the greedy ingestion of something. And the fact is, maybe I was embarrassed and ashamed about the fact that almost all I was, or thought of myself as being, was a brain in a jar, like in Futurama, and that my body revolted me because it couldn't dance, it couldn't bowl, it couldn't bat, it wasn't graceful, it wasn't interesting, it wasn't cute. And yet, my body made demands on me. It made huge demands. It made the demands of the sugar and the coffee and the cigarettes. And then the cocaine, it kept it going. It was the only thing, and it's very hard. I'm certainly, I think there's nothing less dignified than a celebrity talking about his past addictions. It's a very hard thing to get right. On the one hand, if you deny them, people think you're being secretive and hypocritical and so on. On the other hand, if you go on about them, people either think you're boasting or you're being sententious and sanctimonious about it. So all one can try and do is stand back from oneself and observe it. The thing that astonished me in that period was how prevalent it was in the world I inhabited and in the sort of worlds that it orbited, whether there's art or journalism or music or whatever it was, and wider out into the city and banking and so on. And there was a period, I think, towards the late 80s and early 90s when I honestly did not believe that anybody I met didn't take cocaine. I just
Maybe
couldn't.
you were right.
And sometimes I was wrong. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, how do they get away with it? How do they what is it like not taking cocaine? How does that work? I was really puzzled by it. Anyway, I no longer do. I was, doing something or other. My agent called me up and gave a list of inquiries that had been made about things I might do. And I was saying, oh, yes, that sounds interesting, maybe this, maybe that. And she said, oh, and there's a children's story. Would you do an audiobook for a children's story? Now, I'd done audiobooks before. I enjoy, reading stories into a microphone for an audiobook. It's a very pleasurable thing to do, but it's quite time-consuming. So it's usually, if I've got a couple of weeks off, I might just say, oh, I'll do a couple of days to do a novel or something. But this was a children's story, so I thought, I said, yes, that'll be fine. I've got next Wednesday off. She said, well, she said, I'll get it sent to you. And I looked at it, and it was called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I didn't know whether it was Rowling or Rowling. I now know it's Rowling, but and I looked at it, and I opened it. I still have the copy on there, signed by her with my annotations. And as first editions are worth tens of thousands of pounds, it's rather exciting. And I started reading. I mean, my first thought was, this is a novel. This is an adult novel. It's 80,000 words if it's a word.
What had you been expecting?
Sorry?
What had you been expecting?
Well, I expected a children's story. I thought it'd be, and Janet saw that the dog was running fast. Goodbye, dog. Goodbye, Janet. There you go. But it was a little bit more than that. So I thought, oh, well, I obviously won't be able to do that. But I started reading, and I got rather captivated by it. So I called up my agent and said, oh, damn, we're going to have to find two days, at least 3 days maybe, to do this. It's a full-blown novel, but it's rather good. And she said, oh, is it? Oh, good. So I turn up to the reading, and there's the producers and sound engineer and in the glass booth, and the authoress is there. Very nice young woman, J.K. Rowling, Jo Rowling, and we chat, and she's, as it happens, rather nicely a big Fry and Laurie fan, so we talk about Fry and Laurie sketches, and it's very jolly. And looking back on it, I hate to think of it, I might have been a tad patronising. She said she was writing a second one, a sequel to it. I said, are you? Well done! Well done! Very good! Well, I'm sure it'll take off and do really well.
A little patronising?
Yeah. And I'm sure, I don't know, it's quite as bad. And because the first one won the Smarty Award, didn't it, for fiction? Well done, it's really good. So when I did the second one, she told me her plans, and in fact she had planned out a whole 7 of them. And by this time I was really fascinated by it, because the books were extraordinary, and I was beginning to hear, it was just beginning to filter out that these books were very successful, and you were beginning to hear that parents would read them to their children and then sit on the steps at the top of the house and carry on reading them to themselves. And then when she came back after the third one, which was called The Prisoner of Azkaban, she told me about her American signing tour, and this is when she knew that she had entered an entirely new world. It was really extraordinary, the story she told me, and one of them was her first signing. There was an enormous queue, it was Doubleday or whatever in New York, and there were, like 70 boys with spectacles and scars on their foreheads, and there was even a woman with a gold frame around her, being the fat lady in the portrait, all waiting in line, and she sat at her table with someone from her publishers, Scholastic in America they are, and someone from her agents behind her, and people from the bookshop with pens, and, just to make sure everything was going well, a glass of wine here and whatever. And she started signing. And then about the 7th or 8th person said, oh, Miss Rowling, I have an envelope for you. Can love you to see this? And one of the people behind her would snatch it away and go, thank you. And Jo would go, I'm sorry, sorry. And then she would carry on signing. And every now and again, this kept happening. She thought, this is very odd. So by the time we got to the end of the queue, hours later, the final book had been signed and everything was done, and she was dusting her hands. She said to the people behind her, I must say, you were a bit rude with people who had things to give me. They said, oh, no, Jo. You see, what happened is, these people, they have written their own little Harry Potter storyline in which Hermione falls in love with Goyle or whatever, and Dumbledore dies or something, and sure enough, the day will come when some plot twist that you create will be similar to theirs, and they will try and sue your ass. But in front of witnesses, you never touched the envelope. In front of witnesses, you never saw what was inside. And we can depose such is the case. And she thought, what? Is this normal? Of course it isn't normal, but they were right.
They were
sure
right.
enough, the next one comes out, and there are letters to her lawyers saying, I gave you the idea, and I gave you an envelope. And of course, the lawyers were able to write back, she never touched the envelope, fuck off out of my face, you mad bitch. And there you are. Diana Dawes, who was an English actress, around the same time as Joan Collins. She was a starlet, a rank starlet, and she was big blonde hair, and sort of, for a short time, known as the English Marilyn Monroe, until she rather sort of swole up. But she came from Swindon, and her real name was Diana Fluck. And I know, and this is a true story, and it's rather wonderful. The mayor of Swindon, they decided to give Diana Dawes the freedom of Swindon, a little ceremony that you give to your notable citizens. And he was seen pacing up and down in preparation, going, Diana Fluck, Diana Fluck, Diana Fluck. Right, that's okay. I've got it. Then he stood and made his speech. He said, "We are so proud to welcome Swindon's favourite daughter, Diana Clunt." Oh! True. It's...
Funniest person you've ever met?
Peter Cook. Unquestionably Peter Cook. He was incredible. And the extraordinary thing about him, he was funny in the way a beautiful person is beautiful. He didn't turn it on, it was just always there. He could be as funny, if not funnier, just on the corner newsagents buying a newspaper to the person he was buying the newspaper from, as if he were sitting in a talk studio, you know. I remember we went on a holiday. John Cleese, this was a marvellous holiday I went on. John Cleese invited a group of his friends to go up the Nile in a boat. It was a fantastic time. There was Eric Idle was there, and one of my great heroes who's since become a very close friend, William Goldman, the screenwriter who wrote Butch Cassidy and Marathon Man and Princess Bride and many of my favourite films. And of course, Peter Cook was there. And he was just unbelievable. And I remember an example, this has just struck me as perfect satire. He loved newspapers, and we'd been, denied English newspapers for a few days as we sailed up the Nile. We put in at Luxor. He said, "I'm just going off to see if I can find some newspapers." And he came back with this huge bundle of newspapers, distributed them about the boat, and he started to read. And I was laughing at a story I was reading. It was a very bit unfortunate, really, but it was Elizabeth Taylor, who had one of her periodic bouts of blowing up like a balloon. And I said, "Oh dear, look at that picture of Elizabeth Taylor." He said, "Ah, yes." And I said, "But a spokesman says that it's not her, the problem is her glands." He said, "Well, they are, of course, this spokesman is, of course, completely right. She'll be in a suite at the Four Seasons, as it might be, calmly watching the television, one of her old films, perhaps, The VIPs with Orson Welles. And suddenly her glands will pick up the telephone and... they will order a tray of eclairs and a bottle of Courvoisier." He went on painting this scene of Elizabeth Taylor locking herself in the bathroom and her glands knocking the door down and stuffing them down her throat. It was... we were weeping with laughter. But maybe this is a way to finish, because I could do no better than dedicate this to Peter Cook, who was a great friend, and this is an example of what an extraordinary man he was. People think of him as a sad man because he drank a lot and that his life was a disappointment. He was a man who brought extraordinary joy everywhere he went, and this is a perfect example. On this holiday, we went to Abu Simnel, which is where those three huge figures are with the hands on their knees. They're huge, I mean, they're vast. And the idea is you have to see them in the dawn when the sun strikes the stone of these vast, like Ozymandias, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And so we travel, what you do, because it's off the Nile. They used to be on the Nile, but they were removed from when Lake Nasser was made, so they're now in the middle of the desert. So you go to the desert. We arrived at the desert at about 3 in the afternoon, and we had the rest of the afternoon and evening to kill before having to get up very early. And there was a swimming pool. It was blisteringly hot. It's the desert. And there are other guests, not just from our party. But Peter is by the pool, and he's found a beach ball, a smallish beach ball. And it's got coving around the swimming pool. And those steps that come up from the pool and loop, where they're fastened into the ground. And the loop went over past the coving and into the ground. Anyway, I suddenly noticed Peter had one of these balls, and he was looking at it, and he bowled the ball along the coving, and it struck just the edge of the loop, but went through it. And he went, "Ah, a Stannard, 3 points." And I was the only one who heard it, and I thought, I must have imagined it like that. And he went round again, picked up the ball, and bowled it to the other direction, like that. And he bowled it, it went clean through the hoop,
He said, an Abu Simnel, 10 points. And I said, Peter, what are you doing? He said, I am playing the royal and not noticeably ancient game of Abu Simnel. And within an hour, we had all played this game, this fabulous game, and with men against women, people from our group against another tour group. There was some Americans against Britain. The staff started to watch. So we had a tournament, and Eric Idle's wife, Tanya, went up to her room and came down with a vase that was the Abu Simnel Cup. And the staff won. And they were so excited, these Egyptians. They were jumping up and down for joy. They laid out a barbecue for free for all of us to have. And they cooked it for us. And Eric sat with his guitar and sang Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. And it was the happiest day of my life. And it was that Peter Cook could do. It was a gift that he gave that was simply stunning. And it was a hell of a day.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Won't you thank
Thank you very much. Thank you. So much. Thank you, Jen. Thank you.
What's that? Is that for me? Wow, thanks. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. How kind. Thank you very much.
That's lovely.
Honestly.
Thank
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.